To understand what is happening right now between Iran and the United States, you have to go back, not just weeks or months, but decades. The relationship between Washington and Tehran has been one of the most hostile, complicated, and dangerous diplomatic relationships in the entire world since 1979, the year Iran's Islamic Revolution swept the Shah of Iran out of power and replaced him with Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. That revolution was deeply anti-American, and it has defined Iran's foreign policy ever since. For nearly 50 years, Iran and the United States never fully normalized relations. Sanctions piled up, nuclear tensions grew. Proxy wars were fought through Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and various armed militias across Iraq and Syria. Iran was widely accused of funding terrorism, destabilizing its neighbors, and secretly working toward a nuclear weapons capability. Accusations Iran consistently denied, saying its nuclear program was for peaceful energy purposes. There were moments of diplomacy. The most significant was the 2015 nuclear deal, known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, brokered under President Barack Obama. Under that deal, Iran agreed to limit its nuclear enrichment in exchange for relief from crippling international sanctions. The deal was fragile, controversial, and politically contested, but it held for a few years. Then, in 2018, President Donald Trump, during his first term, pulled the United States out of the deal entirely, calling it the worst deal ever made. Sanctions returned harder than before. Iran's economy began to fracture. By the time 2023 arrived, Iran was not in a strong position. The country's economy was suffering badly from years of sanctions. The Iranian rial had collapsed in value. Food prices had skyrocketed. Unemployment was widespread, especially among young Iranians. Anti-government protests had already shaken the regime badly, most notably the Woman, Life, Freedom movement of 2022 that erupted after the death of Mahsa Amini, a young Iranian woman who died in the custody of Iran's morality police. Meanwhile, Iran's network of regional allies, what Tehran calls the axis of resistance, was being systematically dismantled. Hezbollah in Lebanon had suffered enormous losses in an escalating conflict with Israel throughout 2024 and into 2025. Hamas in Gaza was devastated after Israel's military campaign following the October 7, 2023 terrorist attacks. The Houthis in Yemen, while still active, were facing sustained American and British strikes. Iran's strategic influence across the Middle East was shrinking. In June 2025, Israel launched a 12-day war directly against Iran, the first direct conflict between the two countries. Israeli strikes degraded Iran's air defenses, damaged key nuclear sites, and sent a message that Iran was more vulnerable than many had assumed. By the end of that 12-day war, Iran was left weakened militarily and economically, while Israel had demonstrated its willingness and capability to strike deep inside Iranian territory. Then came the final wave of unrest that would accelerate everything. Beginning in late December 2025, massive nationwide anti-government protests erupted across Iran, spreading to over 100 cities. The protests were driven by a combination of economic desperation, the collapse of the rial, hyperinflation, shortages of basic goods, and a deeper widespread rage at the clerical regime that had ruled Iran for nearly 50 years. Demonstrators were calling not just for reform, but for regime change. These were the largest protests in Iran since the 1979 revolution itself. The Iranian government did not respond with dialogue. It responded with brutal repression. Government forces massacred protesters in the streets. The deadliest single incidents occurred on January 8th and January 10th, 2026. By the time the violence peaked, estimates of the death toll ranged wildly depending on the source. The US-based human rights activist news agency put the number at roughly 7,000 dead. The Iranian government's own figure was 317. Some non-government Iranian health officials cited figures as high as 32,000. Whatever the exact number, it was a massacre on a massive scale. Washington was watching all of this very closely. On January 2nd, 2026, President Donald Trump issued a stark warning, threatening a lock and loaded military intervention in Iran if the government decided to kill peaceful protesters. It was not a subtle statement. Trump followed it up on January 13th, 2026, by expressing direct support for the Iranian anti-government protesters and pledging that help is on the way. He told Iranians to remember the names of their killers, warning those responsible would pay a very big price. Then, on January 23rd, 2026, Trump made the announcement that sent shockwaves through every foreign ministry in the world. He declared that a U.S. Armada was heading to the Middle East, including the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln and several guided missile destroyers. The message was unmistakable. America was not just watching Iran. America was positioning itself for something much bigger. On January 29, 2026, Trump used his Truth Social platform to escalate the rhetoric further, declaring that A massive armada is heading to Iran, moving with great power, enthusiasm, and purpose. He warned that if Iran did not agree to a deal, the next attack will be far worse. The EU, for its part, designated Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organization on January 29, 2026, placing it on the same list as al-Qaeda and ISIS, a move that triggered asset freezes, travel bans, and a prohibition on funding IRGC-affiliated entities. February 2026 became a month of frantic diplomatic activity that ultimately led nowhere. On February 6, 2026, the United States and Iran held indirect talks in Muscat, Oman, mediated by Oman's foreign minister, Badr bin Hamad al-Busaidi. These were the first serious negotiations in months. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, represented Tehran. Steve Witkoff, Trump's special envoy, represented Washington. A second round of talks took place in Rome in mid-February, but progress was elusive. The core issue was Iran's nuclear enrichment program. The Trump administration was demanding that Iran completely dismantle its nuclear and missile programs, a demand Iran flatly refused. Iran, for its part, insisted on its right to enrich uranium. The Omani foreign minister tried to bridge the gap, saying there had been significant progress and that Iran was willing to make concessions. But Trump said publicly that he was not thrilled with the talks. On February 17, 2026, during the second round of talks in Geneva, Iran's Supreme Leader Khamenei made a stunning threat, telling American negotiators that Iran was capable of sinking U.S. warships in the Strait of Hormuz. As if to back up the threat, Iran briefly closed the Strait of Hormuz for several hours during a military fire drill. For the global economy, which depends on roughly 1/5 of all oil shipments passing through that narrow waterway, the message was terrifying. On February 13, 2026, Trump ordered the aircraft carrier USS Gerald R. Ford and its supporting warships to sail to the Middle East, adding to the already formidable naval force building in the region. The noose was tightening. The diplomatic window was closing rapidly. By February 18th, a detailed analysis in Axios concluded that there were no signs of a diplomatic breakthrough and that war was the most likely outcome. The administration pressed its position: Iran must dismantle everything. Iran refused. On February 24th, 2026, during his State of the Union address, Trump told the American people and the world that Iran was rebuilding its nuclear weapons program and developing missiles capable of reaching Europe, and would soon be working on missiles capable of reaching the United States itself. The clock, he implied, had nearly run out. According to a White House statement, Iran had rejected an American proposal that would have allowed Iran to have a civilian nuclear program with American investment, in exchange for fully dismantling its military nuclear program. Iran said no. With that rejection, the path to war became essentially inevitable. On February 27, 2026, one day before the strikes, multiple embassies were evacuated from Tehran. The U.S. State Department declared Iran a state sponsor of wrongful detention. Intelligence was already flowing, indicating that the strikes were imminent. According to reports, the Trump administration had received intelligence that Iran was planning a preemptive missile launch against U.S. assets in the region, though an unspecified Pentagon source later told Congress in closed-door briefings that there was no definitive intelligence proving Iran planned to strike first. On the Israeli side, there had been months of elaborate deception operations, a coordinated effort by U.S. and Israeli intelligence to mislead Iran's satellite surveillance systems about the state of readiness at air bases. IDF planes were kept looking dormant. Senior commanders took their official cars home from IDF headquarters, so satellite imagery would show that the base did not appear to be on a war footing. It was a sophisticated and successful deception campaign. Then came the night of Saturday, February 28, 2026. At 20:38 UTC on that date, which was late evening in Washington and just before midnight in Tehran, President Donald Trump gave the order to proceed with Operation Epic Fury. At 20:38 UTC on February 28, 2026, President Trump gave the order. Within minutes, a joint American-Israeli operation was underway, one of the most audacious military strikes in modern history. At 06:35 UTC the following morning, CENTCOM announced that it and partner forces had begun airstrikes against Iran. The world woke up to a war that had begun while most people slept. The opening salvo of the war was not aimed at a military base or an air defense system. It was aimed at the heart of the Iranian government itself. U.S. and Israeli strikes killed Supreme Leader Khamenei, the man who had ruled Iran with an iron fist for over 34 years. Alongside him, several other senior Iranian officials were killed, including Minister of Defense Aziz Nasirzadeh and the head of Iran's Revolutionary Guard, Mohammad Pakpour. It was a decapitation strike of breathtaking precision and political consequence. The strikes targeted key military facilities, nuclear sites, missile production facilities, and command and control infrastructure across Iran. Warships in the Persian Gulf launched cruise missiles. B-2 stealth bombers, The most advanced aircraft in the American arsenal, were used to strike hardened underground targets with 2,000-pound bunker buster bombs. Israeli F-35s and other jets struck from multiple directions simultaneously. In Tehran, explosions lit up the night sky. Smoke rose over the city as Iranians woke to the reality that their country was at war. Internet access across Iran was cut. The 2026 Iran internet blackout had begun, eventually surpassing 100 hours of darkness, keeping ordinary Iranians from knowing the full extent of what was happening inside their own country and to their own government. Plumes of thick black smoke were visible from satellite imagery rising across Tehran. The building where Iran's Assembly of Experts was expected to meet on March 3rd to select a new supreme leader was destroyed by Israeli strikes, a calculated move to delay and disrupt the political succession process. Iran's most senior leaders, suddenly aware that they were targets, scattered. The Iranian government, in chaos, launched its response almost immediately. Hundreds of missiles and thousands of drones were fired in all directions, at Israel, at American military bases across the region, and at civilian and military targets in Arab states that housed U.S. forces. The response was massive, indiscriminate, and devastating in places. An Iranian strike hit Dubai International Airport, one of the busiest airports in the world, damaging it and forcing a complete halt to all flights. The airport eventually reopened in limited capacity, but the blow to international aviation and commerce was immediate and severe. Shipping lines began rerouting away from the Strait of Hormuz even before Iran formally threatened to close it. Insurance costs skyrocketed and oil prices began their steep climb. On the very first day of the war, the Lebanese militant group Hezbollah, weakened but still dangerous, began firing rockets and missiles at Israel, calling it retaliation for the killing of Khamenei and framing it as a defensive response to what it called over a year of Israeli aggression. The Lebanese government, which had been trying to disarm Hezbollah since 2023, immediately banned Hezbollah's military activities, a ban that Hezbollah largely ignored. The United Kingdom, France, and Germany issued a joint statement on February 28th condemning Iran's counterstrikes and calling for a resumption of diplomacy. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer said he did not believe in regime change from the skies, making clear that Britain was not a participant in the offensive strikes, though he would later allow the US to use British military bases for what he described as a specific and limited defensive purpose, specifically to destroy Iranian missiles at their source. Those bases included Diego Garcia in the British Indian Ocean Territory and RAF Fairford in Gloucestershire. By the second day of the war, the Gulf region was in chaos. A yacht was photographed sailing away from Dubai's Jebel Ali port as smoke billowed in the background from Iranian drone strikes. Dubai International Airport, which had been damaged the day before, remained in limited operation. Hundreds of thousands of people, tourists, expatriates, residents, were stranded across the Middle East as flights were halted, rerouted, or canceled indefinitely. Iran struck American military infrastructure across the region with wave after wave of missiles and drones. The Iranian attack also hit infrastructure from neutral countries. An Italian installation in Iraq and Kuwait was struck. A French naval facility in the United Arab Emirates was hit. These were not accidents. They were signals from Tehran that no one in the region was safe from Iran's retaliation. The message was, if you house American forces, you are a target. UAE officials began reporting staggering numbers of interceptions. In just the first days of the war, the UAE alone claimed to have downed 148 Iranian drones, 9 ballistic missiles, and half a dozen cruise missiles. Bahrain's air defense systems were also working overtime, intercepting dozens of incoming threats. Qatar reported that several key areas of its territory were being evacuated as Iranian attacks continued to pour in. A U.S. soldier was attacked in Saudi Arabia on this day, a wound that would later prove fatal. Meanwhile, the U.S. Central Command continued its strikes across Iran. U.S. Air Force B-2 bombers struck Iranian ballistic missile facilities. The USAF declared that CENTCOM had been instructed to dismantle the Iranian regime's security apparatus, an extraordinarily broad mandate that effectively meant the entirety of Iran's military political establishment was a legitimate target. A U.S. submarine, operating covertly in the Indian Ocean near Sri Lanka, sank the Iranian warship Iris Dena, which had been returning from the International Fleet Review 2026, which had been held in Visakhapatnam, India. The ship went down off the coast of Galay, Sri Lanka. 87 Iranian crew members were killed. 32 were rescued by the Sri Lankan Navy. Hours later, U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth confirmed the attack. A second Iranian warship, the Soleimani-class corvette, was sunk later the same day in a U.S.-Israeli airstrike on the port of Bandar Abbas, inside Iran itself. March 2, 2026, brought one of the most painful and embarrassing incidents for the U.S.-led coalition. A Kuwaiti F-A-18 pilot shot down 3 American F-15E fighters in a friendly fire incident. It was a catastrophic failure of communication and coordination in what was already an extraordinarily complex air combat environment. The 6 crew members of the 3 American jets survived, a miracle of sorts, but the incident exposed the enormous risks of fighting a multi-nation air war in a congested airspace. Also, on March 2nd, the United States Embassy in Kuwait was struck by an Iranian missile. Secretary of State Marco Rubio immediately ordered the embassy closed until further notice. It was a significant symbolic and strategic blow, Iran demonstrating that even American diplomatic compounds were not safe. The U.S. announced on the same day that U.S. fatalities had risen to 6, with 4 others seriously injured. All 6 of the confirmed American dead had been killed in a single Iranian airstrike on a U.S. base in Kuwait. 4 of the victims were identified as members of the 103rd Expeditionary Sustainment Command, headquartered in Des Moines, Iowa. By March 5th, the World Health Organization had identified 13 Iranian health infrastructure sites that had been struck during the war, along with 1 health facility in Lebanon. Iran's foreign minister said that U.S. strikes had destroyed a desalination plant on Keshem Island, cutting clean water supplies to 30 villages. The U.S. and Israel denied responsibility. Meanwhile, the Russian consulate in Isfahan was also reported damaged by U.S.-Israeli airstrikes, a complication that added diplomatic tension with Moscow to an already overwhelming crisis. One of the most horrific allegations of the early days of the war emerged around this period. Sources told CBS News that the U.S. may have been responsible for the bombing of a girls' elementary school in Iran in the early hours of the war, which killed 168 people. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth ordered an investigation, saying the probe would take as long as necessary. He said flatly that Iran was the only nation in the war that deliberately targeted civilians. But the investigation remained open and unresolved. With Khamenei dead, Iran faced a constitutional crisis unlike any in its history. Under Iran's constitution, an interim leadership council was established on March 1st to exercise the functions of head of state, while a new supreme leader was selected. The interim council functioned in deeply chaotic circumstances, with communications disrupted, many senior officials in hiding or displaced, and Israel having deliberately destroyed the building where the Assembly of Experts was supposed to meet. On March 8, 2026, Mojtaba Khamenei, the 56-year-old son of the late Supreme Leader, was elected to replace his father. It was a dynastic succession in a system that was theoretically based on religious qualification rather than family lineage. The move was deeply controversial. Iran's top leaders, including Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf and Ali Larijani, were involved in the process, though Larijani was simultaneously named on a U.S. rewards list. The U.S. State Department offered rewards of up to $10 million for information on Mojtaba, Khamenei, Larijani, and Esmail Khatib, Iran's Minister of Intelligence. Also on March 8th, CENTCOM announced that a U.S. soldier who had been wounded in an attack in Saudi Arabia on March 1st had succumbed to his injuries. That same day, a National Guard soldier died from a health-related incident in Kuwait on March 6th during a medical emergency. The casualties were accumulating on the American side, not at the level of a full-scale war, but at a rate that was painful and politically significant at home. Mojtaba Khamenei, despite being selected as supreme leader, remained entirely invisible to the Iranian public and the world. He did not appear in public, he did not speak. A statement attributed to him was read on state television, but the Iranian people had not seen his face or heard his voice. Defense Secretary Hegseth would later say, based on intelligence assessments, that Iran's new supreme leader was wounded and likely disfigured from the initial strikes on February 28th, which may explain why he was not appearing publicly. On March 9th, Iran fired projectiles at Bahrain, striking an industrial area called Ma'amir. Images released by Bahrain's Interior Ministry showed firefighters battling flames from the strike. By this point in the war, Bahrain's air defense systems had intercepted and destroyed a staggering total of 124 ballistic missiles and 203 drones targeting the tiny island kingdom. Bahrain's defense ministry announced on March 14th that Iran had fired 10 drones and 3 additional missiles at the country since the previous day. Iran's military also threatened to attack cities in the United Arab Emirates. The IRGC General Sardar Jabari made statements indicating that Iran had identified U.S. presence on the island of Cyprus and that Iran planned to strike the island with such intensity that the Americans would be forced to leave. The UK's RAF base at Akrotiri in Cyprus was struck by an Iranian drone. Air raid sirens sounded repeatedly in Cyprus. The Cypriot government confirmed that 2 unidentified drones were intercepted without causing damage, and Greece subsequently announced it would deploy frigates and F-16s to defend Cyprus from further Iranian strikes. Hamas, itself a beneficiary of Iranian funding, issued a remarkable statement on March 9th, calling on Iran not to target neighboring countries in the Gulf. It urged an end to the conflict and emphasized Iran's right to respond to military action while simultaneously calling for dialogue. It was a sign of how complex the geopolitical picture had become. Even Iran's closest allies were urging restraint as the scope of the war expanded dangerously. On March 13th, 2026, the 14th day of the war, one of the worst single incidents affecting American forces took place, not on the battlefield in a traditional sense, but in the skies over western Iraq. Two U.S. Air Force Boeing KC-135 Stratotanker refueling aircraft were involved in an incident. One of the tankers, carrying 6 crew members, went down in western Iraq. The other aircraft, damaged, managed to land safely in Israel. CENTCOM initially reported the incident without full details. The circumstances were unclear. But within hours, the grim confirmation came. The U.S. Central Command announced that all 6 crew members aboard the downed KC-135 had been killed. The agency confirmed the loss of the aircraft was not due to hostile fire or friendly fire. It appeared to be a non-combat incident, possibly mechanical failure or collision, in the extremely demanding operational conditions of a wartime environment. This brought the total U.S. military death toll to 13, with 7 of those deaths caused by enemy fire. The loss of the KC-135 crew was deeply felt. These were support personnel, aviators who kept the war machine flying, whose loss did not make headlines in the same way a frontline combat death might, but whose value to the operation was irreplaceable. It served as a reminder that in modern warfare, no role is without mortal risk. Also on March 13th, the U.S. temporarily lifted restrictions on the sale of Russian oil as a measure to help manage the economic costs of the war. With Iranian oil largely blocked from global markets due to the Strait of Hormuz crisis, oil prices had surged well above $100 per barrel, the highest level since August 2022. Washington needed to stabilize energy markets before the price increases caused a domestic political crisis back home. The Kremlin, for its part, welcomed the move and noted that the world could not afford to lose Russian oil. Imagine a piece of land barely 5 miles long, a coral outcrop in the northern Persian Gulf baking under a relentless sun, surrounded by the blue-green waters of one of the most strategically contested waterways on Earth. It has no major city, no tourist hotels, no famous landmarks. It is a restricted zone, a place where only people with official government security clearances are allowed to set foot. Iranians call it the Forbidden Island. Most people outside the Middle East had never heard of it before March 2026. But on the night of March 13th to 14th, 2026, Kharg Island became the most talked about piece of land on the planet. The United States launched what President Donald Trump called one of the most powerful bombing raids in the history of the Middle East, aimed squarely at a tiny coral island that most Americans could not find on a map. And yet, the decision to strike Kharg Island, and especially the decision about what not to strike, may prove to be one of the most consequential strategic choices in the entire 2026 Iran conflict. To understand why, you have to understand what Kharg Island actually is. Not just what it does today, but where it came from, how it became the absolute center of gravity for Iran's entire economy, what it has survived in the past, and what its fate means for the future of this war. Kharg Island is not a new place. It has been inhabited and visited by traders, conquerors, and travelers for well over 1,000 years. Medieval Arabic sources from around 982 AD describe it as a good source of pearls. And for centuries, the Persian Gulf was one of the world's great pearl fishing regions. The island sits at a natural crossroads along ancient maritime routes connecting India to the port city of Basra in what is now Iraq, making it a natural stopping point for trading ships navigating the shallow and tricky waters of the northern Gulf. Archaeologists have found traces of human presence on Kharg dating back to the ancient Achaemenid Persian Empire, the civilization that built the great palaces at Persepolis, that fought the Battle of Thermopylae, that ruled from the Mediterranean to the Indus River. Rock-cut tombs found on the island share striking features with funerary monuments from Palmyra in modern-day Syria, suggesting complex cross-cultural connections across the ancient world. There are also ruins of a Christian monastery that may date back to the 7th century, a remnant of the Church of the East, one of the earliest Christian traditions, which spread across Persia and Central Asia in the first millennium of the Common Era. In the 16th century, the Portuguese Empire, then the dominant naval power in the Indian Ocean, controlled the island as part of its commercial network across the Gulf. In the 18th century, the Dutch East India Company established a trading station there, only to be expelled by a local governor after a violent confrontation in 1765. In the 19th century, the British occupied the island twice, briefly during the 1837 siege of Herat, and again during the Anglo-Persian War of 1856. In the 20th century, Reza Shah Pahlavi, who ruled Iran from 1925 to 1941, repurposed Kharg as a place of exile for political opponents, keeping it isolated and underdeveloped. All of that history, the pearl divers, the Portuguese soldiers, the Dutch traders, the British expeditions, the political prisoners, was simply prologue to what came next. Because in 1956, oil engineers arrived on Kharg Island and began building something that would transform not just the island, but Iran's entire relationship with the modern world. The story of Kharg Island's transformation into an oil powerhouse begins with a simple but critical geographical fact. Almost all of Iran's coastline along the Persian Gulf is shallow, silty, and impossible for large ships to navigate. Supertankers, the massive vessels that carry millions of barrels of crude oil across the world's oceans, simply cannot dock near most of the Iranian mainland because the water is not deep enough. Engineers needed a different solution. Kharg Island was that solution. The waters around Kharg drop quickly into the deep channel of the northern Gulf, making it one of the very few locations in the region where large ocean-going tankers can safely berth. In 1956, construction began on oil storage reservoirs on the island, fed by pipelines from the vast Gachsaran oil field on the Iranian mainland, one of the largest oil fields in the Middle East. By the 1960s, under the rule of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, Kharg was being developed into Iran's principal crude oil export terminal in a joint venture with the American oil company Amoco. The construction that followed was extraordinary in its scale. Long jetties were built stretching out into the Gulf's deep waters, equipped with loading arms capable of pumping millions of barrels of crude oil per hour directly into waiting supertankers. Pipelines were laid, connecting the island to offshore oil fields in the Gulf, including the Abuzar, Firuzan, and Darude fields, as well as to major onshore fields in the oil-rich Khuzestan province on the Iranian mainland. Storage tanks were built in clusters across the island, each holding 1 million barrels or more of crude oil in reserve. By the early 1970s, Kharg had become the world's largest offshore crude oil terminal, a designation it would hold for decades. By around 1975, the island had 3 major oil terminals: the Kharg Terminal, the Sea Island Terminal, and the Darius Terminal, plus the Kharg Chemical Complex, a gas terminal processing liquefied petroleum gas and petrochemicals alongside the crude oil operations. The entire island, which measures just 22 square kilometers, roughly the size of a single district in a mid-sized American city, had been transformed into a dense interlocking system of pipes, valves, pumps, storage tanks, and loading facilities unlike anywhere else on Earth. When the Shah was overthrown in the 1979 Islamic Revolution and Amoco's property was expropriated by the new Iranian government, Kharg Island did not slow down. It simply changed owners. The Islamic Republic inherited the infrastructure and expanded it aggressively. By the mid-2020s, the terminal had the capacity to simultaneously load 10 supertankers at once. Its historical maximum loading capacity had reached a staggering 7 million barrels per day. Even under the heavy sanctions of the 2010s and early 2020s, Iran kept exporting oil through Kharg, primarily to China and India, countries that were willing to buy Iranian crude at steep discounts to circumvent Western sanctions. A CIA document from 1984, declassified decades later, described Kharg Island's facilities as the most vital in Iran's oil system, and their continued operation is essential to Iran's economic well-being. That assessment was made over 40 years ago. In 2026, it is still true. In fact, it is more true than ever because Iran has become more dependent on Kharg over time, not less. Today, roughly 90 to 95% of Iran's crude oil exports flow through this single island. All of those exports then travel south through the Persian Gulf and pass through the Strait of Hormuz before reaching the open ocean and heading to buyers in Asia. There is one historical precedent for what is now happening to Kharg Island that every military analyst and energy expert was studying carefully as the 2026 war began, the Iran-Iraq War of 1980 to 1988. During that brutal 8-year conflict, Iraqi forces repeatedly targeted Kharg Island in an attempt to cut off Iran's oil revenue and strangle the Iranian war economy. Iraqi aircraft struck the island multiple times throughout the early and mid-1980s. In the autumn of 1986, the damage was severe enough that much of the terminal infrastructure was temporarily put out of commission, a major blow to Iran's ability to fund the war effort. Iran adapted. It shifted oil loading operations to smaller, more dispersed facilities at Lavon Island and Siri Island, further south along the Gulf Coast. These facilities had far less capacity than Kharg, but they were enough to keep some oil flowing. Iran survived. After the war ended in 1988, Iran spent years repairing and massively expanding Kharg's facilities. Rather than learning the lesson that concentration of export capacity at a single point was a vulnerability, Tehran did the opposite. It doubled down on Kharg, investing further in the island's infrastructure because its deep water access simply had no real alternative. The lesson Iran drew was not to diversify away from Kharg, but to defend it harder. The IRGC took over security of the island. Access was severely restricted. Kharg became the Forbidden Island, off limits to all but cleared personnel, surrounded by military installations, anti-aircraft missile batteries, and naval base facilities that formed the outer ring of the island's defenses. As the 2026 war between the US, Israel, and Iran began on February 28th, analysts around the world immediately began asking the same question. Would the Americans and Israelis target Kharg Island? The debate was intense and public. Former Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid said explicitly that destroying Kharg would cripple Iran's economy and topple the regime. John Van Eck, CEO of the financial firm Van Eck Funds, told CNBC on March 2nd that he believed Trump would use Kharg as a leverage point, comparing it to how Trump had used oil sanctions to pressure Venezuela during his first term. But other analysts warned that attacking the oil infrastructure on Kharg would be catastrophically dangerous for the global economy. Oil prices, which had already been surging since the war began, were approaching $120 a barrel even before any strike on the island. If the oil terminals themselves were destroyed, the global energy market, which depends on roughly 1.6 million barrels per day flowing through Kharg to buyers in China and India, would face a sudden, severe supply shock. Petros Katinas, a research fellow at RUSI, the London-based defense think tank, said that seizing Kharg would cut off Iran's oil lifeline, which was essential for the regime, but warned that a seizure would require ground troops. It could make the island a multi-week target for Iranian drone strikes. Andreas Krieg of King's College London told France 24 that Kharg is one of the few places in the entire conflict where a strike could have immediate strategic and economic consequences. Neil Quilliam of the Chatham House think tank described the island as the crown jewel of Iran's oil industry. Former White House Situation Room head Mark Gustafson wrote publicly that Trump might be tempted to seize the island entirely, not just strike it, noting that a physical U.S. occupation of Kharg would give the U.S. a natural barrier from the Iranian mainland, a massive PR victory, and unmatched leverage over the Iranian regime. But Gustafson also warned that any attempt to seize the island would require ground troops, be fraught with risk, and could trigger catastrophic oil price spikes. For the first 2 weeks of the war, so from February 28th to March 12th, Kharg Island went untouched. The U.S. and Israeli strikes were devastating across Iran. Nuclear sites, missile facilities, IRGC bases, command infrastructure, warships, government buildings. But Kharg sat silent and operational. Tanker Trackers, an organization that uses satellite imagery and shipping data to monitor crude oil flows, reported that Kharg had been loading tankers non-stop since the war broke out. In the weeks before the war, exports from the island had actually been ramped up to near record levels, Iran front-loading as much revenue as it could before the expected attack. J.P. Morgan noted that as of early March, roughly 18 million barrels of crude were stored on the island, out of a total storage capacity of approximately 30 million barrels. On the morning of Friday, March 13th, Fox News anchor Brian Kilmeade had President Trump on a live radio interview. The conversation turned to Kharg Island. Kilmeade asked directly, "Are you thinking about taking Kharg Island, where 90% of Iranian oil goes through?" Trump's answer was deliberately evasive. He said he could not answer a question like that. He said it was one of so many different things. He gave no direct answer, but he did not deny it either. In hindsight, the evasion was itself the answer. The order had already been given, or was about to be. Across the day, the Pentagon was finalizing operational details. B-2 Spirit stealth bombers, the most advanced aircraft in the U.S. military, capable of delivering precision strikes from altitudes enemy radar cannot reliably track, were being prepared for launch. CENTCOM later released footage of the B-2s taking off, though it was withheld until the aircraft were safely back on the ground. The strike plan was precise and deliberate. Hit every military installation, every weapons depot, every air defense position on Kharg Island, but do not touch the oil terminals, the loading jetties, the storage tanks, or the pipelines. The oil infrastructure was to be preserved, intact, as a hostage. The choice of the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber for this mission carried its own message. The B-2 is not a routine aircraft. It is one of only 20 in the entire U.S. Air Force inventory. It can carry the massive Ordnance Penetrator, a 30,000-pound bunker buster bomb designed specifically to destroy deeply buried, hardened underground facilities. Its use against Kharg Island told the world that the U.S. was not sending a warning shot. It was sending its best. Every military analyst watching the operation understood that the same aircraft, in a follow-up strike, could reduce the oil terminals to rubble within hours if the order was ever given. Also on March 13th, all 6 crew members of the KC-135 Stratotanker refueling plane that had gone down in western Iraq the previous day were confirmed dead by CENTCOM. The U.S. military death toll was now 13. There was grief in Washington and in the home communities of those 6 young Americans, aviators, engineers, mission specialists, whose lives were taken not in combat, but in the relentless grind of sustaining a wartime air operation. And yet, the strike against Kharg Island continued on schedule. The war does not pause for its dead. Late on the night of Friday, March 13th, U.S. forces executed the strike on Kharg Island. It was swift, massive, and precisely targeted. B-2 stealth bombers delivered their payloads. Ship-launched weapons may have contributed to what became a sustained multi-wave assault on the island's military infrastructure. Iranians living on the mainland in Bushehr province, just 25 kilometers across the water, heard the explosions clearly in the darkness. People woke to the sound of detonations rolling across the Gulf. Iran's semi-official Fars news agency reported that more than 15 large explosions were heard on the island. Satellite footage geolocated by CNN confirmed the strike locations. The airport facilities and runway on the island were visibly struck. Thick black smoke rose into the night sky over the Persian Gulf. The targets destroyed were specific and deliberate. Naval mine storage facilities, the very mines Iran had been using to threaten shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, were obliterated. Missile storage bunkers were destroyed. The airport control tower was taken out. A helicopter hangar was reduced to rubble. Air defense positions around the island, the anti-aircraft missile batteries that had formed the outer ring of Kharg's military protection, were systematically eliminated. The Joshan Sea base, the IRGC's naval installation on the island, was struck. In total, CENTCOM confirmed that more than 90 Iranian military targets on Kharg Island were hit and destroyed in the operation. And through all of it, through all 90-plus targets, through all 15-plus explosions, the oil terminals sat untouched. The loading jetties were undamaged. The pipelines were intact. The massive storage tanks holding 18 million barrels of crude oil were unscathed. The pumping stations were operational. It was a surgical, deliberate performance. Destroy everything that makes the island a military asset, while leaving everything that makes it an economic asset perfectly, tauntingly intact. As the smoke was still rising over Kharg Island, President Trump took to his Truth Social account to announce the operation to the world. He wrote that moments ago, at his direction, the United States Central Command had executed one of the most powerful bombing raids in the history of the Middle East and totally obliterated every military target in Iran's crown jewel, Kharg Island. He said U.S. weapons were the most powerful and sophisticated the world had ever known. He said he had chosen, for reasons of decency, not to wipe out the oil infrastructure on the island. Then came the threat. In language that required no interpretation, Trump warned that should Iran, or anyone else, do anything to interfere with the free and safe passage of ships through the Strait of Hormuz, he would immediately reconsider his decision to spare the oil infrastructure. The message was simple. The terminals are still standing because we chose to spare them. Close the strait, and we will not be so generous next time. In a second early morning post, Trump said that Iran was totally defeated and wanting a deal, but not a deal he would accept. Speaking to reporters before boarding Air Force One for Florida, he said the military campaign would last as long as necessary, but that they were way ahead of schedule. And when pushed on what he meant by unconditional surrender, he explained it in his own terms. To me, it means very simply that we are in a position of dominance that nobody has seen before, whether or not they are able to say the actual words. Then he said, following Kharg Island, Iran would be wise to lay down their arms and save what is left of their country. Iran's response came on three fronts simultaneously. The first was denial of damage. Ehsan Jahanian, the deputy governor of Bushehr province, stated publicly on Noor News that oil operations on the island were proceeding normally, that export and import activities were ongoing, and that no casualties had been reported among military personnel, company employees, or island residents. This was unusually consistent with what CENTCOM itself had confirmed. The oil infrastructure had been deliberately left untouched. The second response was a direct military threat. The IRGC sent a message to the United Arab Emirates, host to tens of thousands of American troops at Al Dhafra Air Base and other facilities, warning that U.S. hideouts across the UAE were now legitimate targets following the Kharg strikes. It was an escalation signal of the most serious kind. Iran was threatening to bring the war into a country that had, up to that point, avoided being directly struck. The third and most alarming response came from Iran's military command. Tehran warned that if the oil infrastructure on Kharg Island itself was ever attacked, Iran would retaliate by targeting oil facilities across the Gulf region belonging to U.S.-friendly companies. Iranian state media warned those facilities would be reduced to a pile of ashes. Al Jazeera's correspondent in Tehran described this as Iran's most powerful remaining card, a counter-deterrent designed to prevent the one escalation Tehran feared most. If Kharg's terminals burn, Saudi Aramco facilities, UAE energy installations, and other Gulf oil infrastructure would face Iranian retaliation, and the resulting global energy disruption would be catastrophic for everyone, including the United States. Iran's Minister of Intelligence denied that Iran was engaged in any ceasefire or peace negotiations, directly contradicting Trump's claim that Iran was totally defeated and seeking a deal. The contradiction between Washington and Tehran on this point reflected the classic fog of war. Both sides were managing domestic and international audiences simultaneously, with statements calibrated more for political effect than for factual accuracy. As for the new Supreme Leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, March 14th was his 6th day in power. He had still not appeared publicly. He had not spoken. The first Friday of his rule, which was also Al-Quds Day, when Iran's Supreme Leader traditionally appears before massive crowds, passed without him showing his face. A senior Iranian official confirmed to CNN that he remained wounded. The man who was supposed to lead Iran through the gravest crisis in the Islamic Republic's history was, for the moment, invisible to his own people. The Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, is the bottleneck through which roughly 20% of the world's entire oil supply passes every single day. Every barrel of oil that leaves Kharg Island must travel south through the Persian Gulf and pass through the strait to reach the open ocean. There is no other exit. Since the war began on February 28th, Iran had been systematically harassing shipping in the strait, not closing it completely, but mining it, threatening vessels, using drones to make passage dangerous enough that insurance rates skyrocketed, and many shipping companies began rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope rather than risk the transit. By March 14th, the economic damage was severe and mounting. Brent crude oil futures had closed above $100 per barrel for the second straight day, the first time that had happened since August 2022. Oil prices had surged more than 40% since the war began just 15 days earlier. U.S. gas prices had climbed to an average of $3.68 per gallon, according to the American Automobile Association, a 23% jump in 2 weeks. Every additional day, the strait remained restricted. The economic pain for American consumers deepened. This was, in a very real sense, Iran's most effective remaining weapon. Not missiles or drones, but the price at the pump in Ohio and Pennsylvania. In an attempt to stabilize energy markets, the Trump administration took the extraordinary step on March 13th of temporarily lifting restrictions on the sale of Russian oil, relicensing certain Russian crude products for purchase. It was a remarkable reversal from the same administration that had tightened Russian oil sanctions since the 2022 Ukraine war. The Kremlin was publicly pleased. Moscow said the world could not afford to lose large volumes of Russian oil and welcomed the move as contributing to greater global stability. It was a sign of how much pressure the Iran war was placing on American energy policy. A small but meaningful signal of potential movement came when an Indian official reported that a senior Iranian representative had indicated Tehran was considering allowing some vessels to pass through the strait, with a condition that cargo be traded in Chinese yuan rather than US dollars. It was a politically loaded condition, but even the hint that Iran was open to any passage was significant. 2 Indian-flagged LPG tankers successfully crossed the Strait of Hormuz on March 14th and headed toward ports in western India. The world watched their crossing as a fragile proof of concept. The strait was not completely sealed. Not yet. The Yuan condition was itself deeply revealing about Iran's strategic mindset. Tehran was not simply trying to keep ships moving. It was trying to use the crisis to accelerate a shift away from the US dollar as the dominant currency in global oil trade. China has been pushing for years to have oil traded in yuan rather than dollars, an ambition known as the petro-yuan. If Iran could make even a partial breakthrough on this front, forcing some transactions through the strait to be settled in Chinese currency, it would score a long-term geopolitical point even in the midst of a military catastrophe. It was a signal that, however badly the war was going militarily, Iran's regime was still thinking about its long-term economic and political survival. On March 14th, NPR confirmed that an additional 2,200 U.S. Marines from the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit, based in Okinawa aboard the USS Tripoli, an amphibious assault ship carrying F-35 jets and trained assault forces, had been ordered to join the Armada already operating in the Middle East. CENTCOM had requested the Marines because the operational plan required having forces available to provide options, deliberate language widely understood to mean a ground component was being kept on the table. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth had repeatedly refused to rule out deploying American ground troops in Iran, while simultaneously saying the U.S. would not get bogged down. That careful hedge language left all options open. Former White House Situation Room head Mark Gustafson had argued publicly that seizing Kharg Island physically, not just bombing it, but occupying it, fit perfectly with Trump's documented negotiating instincts. Maximum leverage, maximum PR value, complete control over Iran's economic lifeline. With the island's air defenses now destroyed by the March 13th strike, a Marine landing would face far less resistance than it would have 2 weeks earlier. Trump, when asked whether taking Kharg Island was high on his list, said it was not high on his list. Crucially, he did not say it was off the list. The 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit is one of the most capable rapid response forces in the U.S. military. It is permanently forward deployed in the Pacific, designed to be ready to execute amphibious assault operations, non-combatant evacuation, and a wide range of special operations on short notice. Its F-35B jets, the short takeoff and vertical landing variant, give it the ability to conduct air operations from the USS Tripoli without a conventional airstrip. If the order were given to land Marines on Kharg Island, the 31st MEU would be among the forces most capable of executing that mission. Its movement to the Middle East, in the middle of an active war, was not a casual redeployment. It was a deliberate signal. 15 days into the most consequential conflict in the Middle East in a generation, here is the picture as it stands on the morning of Saturday, March 14th, 2026. The United States and Israel have achieved their core initial military objectives. Iran's Supreme Leader is dead. Its nuclear and missile programs have been significantly degraded. Its military command infrastructure has been systematically dismantled. Its new Supreme Leader is wounded and invisible. Its military capacity is shrinking as wave after wave of drone and missile launches are intercepted at high rates. Its economy was already in crisis, and now the single asset that kept it economically alive, Kharg Island's oil terminals, is standing unscathed only because Washington decided to spare it as a hostage, not because Iran could protect it. And yet Iran has not surrendered. Its officials are threatening to burn Gulf oil facilities. Its IRGC is warning the UAE. Its drones are still flying over Baghdad, Bahrain, and beyond. Iran is fighting a losing war with the tools it has left, not because it believes it can win militarily, but because the regime's political survival depends on not appearing to capitulate. The moment the Iranian public concludes the Supreme Leader has surrendered, the political legitimacy of the entire Islamic Republic system risks unraveling from within. This is the trap that both sides now occupy. The United States has enough military leverage to destroy Iran's economic capacity tomorrow morning, but using that leverage risks a global energy catastrophe, a wider regional war, and an Iran that collapses into ungovernable chaos rather than a manageable negotiated stability. Iran has the will to keep fighting, but fighting means more destruction, more death, and an economy sliding toward genuine collapse that no amount of defiant rhetoric can stop. What comes next? Whether it is a back-channel deal brokered through Oman, a further escalation with U.S. Marines on Kharg's beaches, a strike on the oil terminals that sends oil above $150 a barrel, or a slow degradation until the regime's internal politics force an end, no one in Washington, Tehran, Beijing, or Riyadh can predict with certainty right now. What is certain is this: the Forbidden Island is forbidden no more. The United States has reached into the heart of Iran's economic power and left its fingerprints on every military installation on 22 square kilometers of ancient coral and modern pipeline. The oil is still flowing, the terminals are still loading tankers into the night, but everyone, in every government, every central bank, every shipping company, every airline, every oil trading floor in every city in the world, knows that the next chapter of this story will be written not in diplomatic cables or UN resolutions, but in the decisions made in the next 48 to 72 hours about a small strip of land in the Persian Gulf that most of the world had never heard of before the night the bombs fell.